Wyoming Territory, July of 1877. The sun beat down on Casper's dusty Main Street. The morning Verona Kessler's wedding was called off. She stood on the wooden steps of the chapel in her mother's second-best dress, the lace already yellowed, her fingers clenched tight around a crumpled telegram. Her father's cattle deal had fallen through down in Cheyenne, and with it, the dowry. That was all it took. The groom's family had left before the noon bells rang, their wagon kicking up dust behind them. No apology. No, we'll wait. Just gone. Verona didn't cry. She just stood there, mouth dry, chest hollow, staring at the church door like it was a joke. Most of the town scattered quick, murmuring about bad luck and wasted Sundays. But one man stayed. He leaned against the hitching post, arms crossed, hat low over deep brown eyes. His coat was worn, boots scuffed. He looked like he had not shaved in a week. But there was something steady about him, something that did not waver when everyone else had turned away. "Verona," he said, voice low and certain. "You all right?" She turned. "You know my name?" He stepped down from the post, dusted off his hands. "Yeah, it's hard not to. You used to work at the schoolhouse, right? You read to the younger ones." She nodded. "I remember you now. You're the cowboy that helped Miss Lorne fix her fence last spring." "Bodhi Garner," he said, tipping his hat. "I passed through here every few months, between herding jobs." Something about him made her shoulders drop, just a little. Not pity, she could spot pity a mile off. He looked at her like she was a person, not a ruined bride. "I do not know what to do now," she admitted. "My father mortgaged the last parcel of land for that dowry. My mother's been crying since dawn. We have nothing left." He looked down at the dusty road, then back at her. "You ever think of leaving?" She blinked. "Leave where? With what?" Bodhi reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He opened it, revealing a simple silver ring-wide band. No gem, but polished and clean. "My mother gave this to me before she passed. Said I should give it to someone I could build a life with." Her lips parted, breath caught. "Why are you showing me that?" "Because you deserve better than being left on church steps," he said. "What happened today, that's on them, not you. I do not care about dowries. I care about grit. About the way you stood there like stone when they drove off." She stared at him. "You cannot mean that." "I do," he said. "You do not have to say yes. But I am not taking this ring back. Not now, not ever. It's yours." He pressed it into her hand. She stood frozen, the weight of it in her palm, warm from his skin. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I see you," he said. "And I would not walk away if the whole damn town burned down." She looked at him for a long moment, then closed her fingers around the ring. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "North," he said. "Some land near the Bighorns. I got a small spread I am fixing up." She glanced at the church, then at the empty road. "I do not have anything left here," she said quietly. Bodhi offered his hand. "Then come with me." She hesitated, then took it. They rode north by wagon, slow but steady. Verona sat beside him, holding the reins one day, mending clothes the next, quiet but alert. Bodhi spoke little, but when he did it was with purpose. He asked her about books, about the children she had taught, about the quilting she used to do with her mother. He never brought up the broken wedding. At night, they camped beneath the stars. He made her coffee in the mornings and handed her a tin cup with a small smile. She fixed his torn shirts and started humming again. One evening, as they sat by firelight, Verona turned the ring over in her hand. "You really meant it," she said, "about not taking it back." He looked up from where he was carving a bit of wood. "Every word. You hardly know me." "I know enough," he said. "You stayed kind even after what they did." That says more than 1,000 conversations. She looked at him, firelight dancing on her face. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? I do not know, she said softly. Someone who would use me. Or leave. I have done enough leaving in my life, he said. I am done with that. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she slipped the ring onto her finger. A slow smile spread across Bodhi's face. I will work, she said. I am not afraid of it. I know, he said, voice thick. She stood and crossed to him, kneeling beside his blanket. Her fingers brushed his. I am not afraid of you either. He turned his hand over, laced his fingers with hers. They sat like that until the fire burned low, the mountains watching in silence. By the time they reached his land, the grass was tall and green from summer rains. A small cabin stood near the edge of a stream, rough-built but strong. Verona swung down from the wagon and looked around. This is yours. Ours if you want it, he said. She turned to him, eyes shining. I do. He stepped forward, took her face in his hands. Then we start here. And when he kissed her soft, steady. Sure, she closed her eyes and kissed him back like she had known his name her whole life. Because from that moment on, she would never be left behind again. The cabin held the scent of pine sap and old smoke. Verona paused in the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the dim. The floorboards were rough-hewn, the walls patched where daylight tried to sneak through, and a single iron stove stood against the far wall with a kettle perched crooked on top. It was not much, but it was dry, and it was theirs. Bodhi set down the last of the crates beside the hearth. I'll get the shutters fixed before cold sets in, he said, glancing at the window's loose hinge. She stepped past him, running her hand over the edge of the table. There's work to be done. There's time for it. She turned toward him, brushing her sleeve off her shoulder. I'd rather be moving than sitting still. He gave a quiet nod and reached for the hat hanging from a peg. Then let's get the horses settled. Outside, the air had cooled, the kind of dusk that leaned soft against the skin. They walked together in silence to the small lean to where the horses waited. Verona carried a pail of oats, her fingers gripping the handle until her knuckles whitened. Bodhi opened the gate and let the animals in one by one. You ever kept livestock before? He asked. I helped my uncle with sheep when I was younger, she said, tipping the oats into the trough. Never horses, though. They're easier than folks, he said, brushing one of the geldings along its neck. They only care if you feed 'em and don't raise your voice. She gave a short breath through her nose, not quite a laugh, but close. That may be true. They worked until the sun ducked behind the trees, then walked the path back to the cabin with only the sound of their boots in the grass. Inside, Bodhi lit a lantern and set it on the table. Verona moved to the shelves, inspecting what little they had. A sack of cornmeal, dried beans, some salt pork wrapped in cloth. She reached for the beans. I can boil these with a little of the pork, she said. It won't be much, but it'll fill us. You don't have to cook, he said, leaning against the doorframe. I know, she said, already reaching for the pot. But I want to. He didn't move, just watched her with a quiet stillness that felt heavier than silence. She turned, her hand on the pot's handle. Is something wrong? He looked away, jaw tight. I don't want you to think I brought you here to work for me. I don't, she said. But I didn't come here to be idle either. When he met her eyes again, something in his face softened. All right. As the beans simmered, she found a broom tucked behind the door and swept the floor. Dust rose in thin streaks of light. Bodhi stepped out back, returning with a bundle of firewood that he stacked beside the stove, careful not to spill any bark. When they sat down to eat, the lantern flickered between them. Verona's hair had come loose from its pins, curling at the base of her neck. She didn't fuss with it. She didn't seem to care any more about appearances the way she once had. "I thought I'd feel different," she said after a while. He looked up from his tin plate. "How so? More bitter? Or lost?" She paused, chewing slowly. "But I don't. I just feel quiet." "There's strength in that," he said. "Most folks only know how to be loud." She studied him across the table. "Where'd you grow up?" "Southern Colorado," he said. "Near Trinidad. My folks had a little patch of land. Not much. We lost it before I was grown." "What happened?" He set down his fork. "Drought. Then fever. My older brother didn't make it." She didn't speak for a moment. "You never went back?" "Nothing to go back to." She reached across the table, fingertips brushing his wrist. "I'm sorry." He didn't flinch. "You don't have to be." "But I am." He turned his hand so their fingers met. "I'm not used to that." "You will be," she said softly. The lantern hissed faintly. Outside, crickets began their song. Verona glanced toward the narrow bed against the back wall, then back to him. "There's only one bed," she said. "I'll sleep on the floor," Bodhi said at once. She shook her head. "That's not what I meant." He looked up slowly, searching her face. She stood, her voice steady. "I want you beside me." He rose without a word. They moved together, quiet and unhurried. She unpinned the last of her hair and let it fall, and he shed his coat, folding it over the chair. When they lay down, the mattress creaked beneath their weight. Verona turned toward him, her hand resting over his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me." His arm curved around her waist, anchoring her there. "I always will." And that night, with the wind brushing softly at the shutters and their bodies finally at rest, they slept like the worst had already passed. Because it had. The first frost came early that year, lacing the edges of the grass with silver and drawing thin ice across the morning pale. Verona stood at the stream, her skirts tucked high as she rinsed the last of their linens. Her fingers ached from the cold, but she didn't mind it. It kept her focused. She'd started waking before Bodhi to tend the stove, set water to boil, and walk the ridge to check the snare lines they'd set together. It gave her time to think, alone but not lonely. Bodhi came down the slope with a coil of rope slung across his shoulder and mud on his boots. "One of the fence posts by the west patch is leaning," he said. "I'll get it braced before snow hits." Verona wrung out the shirt in her hands. "I'll help if you show me how." He paused, then gave a single nod. "You'll need gloves." They spent the morning hammering new rails where the old ones had sunk. She held the post steady while he drove the stake, the sound of metal on wood echoing across the flat. When they finished, she leaned against the gate and looked out over the hills. "Will we plant here come spring?" she asked. "If the soil's soft enough. Might be able to get barley in early." "I'd like to try cabbage," she said. "My mother kept a root cellar once. Said cabbage held longer than most anything." Bodhi tilted his head. "You know how to build one?" "I remember watching." She brushed a curl from her cheek. "We'll need stones. The ground stays dry up behind the cabin." He looked at her then, not like she was a stranger sharing his land, but like someone who belonged in the shaping of it. That evening, Verona sat at the table with a length of muslin stretched across her lap. She was stitching by lanternlight, a hem she'd let unravel from one of Bodhi's old work shirts. He sat across from her, rubbing linseed oil into the handle of his axe. "You always sew this neat?" he asked, watching her hands move. She didn't look up. "My grandmother taught me." She'd say, "If the stitch can't hold through wind and rain, it's not worth making." Sounds like she'd have liked it here. Verona gave a faint shrug. "She died before I was 10, but she had a way of making even silence feel full." "You do that?" She glanced up, needle paused. Do what? Make the quiet feel like something good. She didn't answer, just bent her head and kept sewing. The next day, they rode out to the edge of the timberline with a hatchet, a saw, and the wagon bed empty behind them. Bodhi took the lead, his shoulders slightly hunched against the wind. Verona followed, pulling her shawl tight. They found a stand of fallen birch, felled by last month's storm. He showed her how to check the trunk for rot, how to notch clean where the wood would split smooth. They loaded the wagon with armfuls until the wheel dipped under the weight. Veronica wiped her brow with her sleeve. You ever get tired of doing everything the hard way? She asked. He chuckled quietly, tying the last bundle. I get tired, but I never minded the work. On the ride back, he handed her the reins without asking. She took them, adjusting her grip. I never drove a team before this week, she said. You don't drive like it. Back at the cabin, they unloaded the wood beside the shed. Bodhi pulled out a small tin from his coat and handed it to her. What's this? Dried apples. Traded for them off a trapper 2 days before we met. She opened the lid. They were sliced thin, sweet beneath the leathered skin. You were saving them? He took off his hat and leaned against the wall. Didn't have a reason to eat them before. She closed the tin and held it against her chest. You're the kind of man folks don't believe exists. He looked at her then, not with surprise, but with something steady and deep. And you're the kind of woman I never thought I'd be lucky enough to meet. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Finally, she stepped forward, slow as the first snow. I'm not afraid of loving you, she said. His throat worked before he answered. I've loved you since you stood on that church step and didn't break. She reached up, fingers brushing the edge of his jaw, rough with stubble. Then don't wait. He kissed her there, up against the cabin wall, his hands firm around her waist, grounded and real. Her fingers curled into his collar, holding him there like something she never meant to let go of. That night they didn't speak much. She lay with her head on his chest, his arms snug around her back. The wind howled outside, but the fire burned warm, and the walls didn't feel so thin. In the morning, a light snow had fallen, softening the world outside with white. Verona stood at the door, watching it drift. Bodhi wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. Looks like winter's come to stay, she said. So have we, he murmured. And in that quiet, surrounded by cold and pine and the slow rhythm of breath shared between them, they stood together, warm. By mid-December, the stream had frozen over, and the days shortened until dusk arrived while the sun still lingered behind the hills. Verona stitched by the window that afternoon, patching the toe of one of Bodhi's wool socks, when she caught sight of a figure moving along the ridge. It wasn't Bodhi. He'd gone east before sunrise to trap along the creek bed. This shape was broader, moving slower, with a limp in the left leg. She set the sock down and reached for the rifle leaning near the door. By the time the man reached the clearing, she'd stepped outside and leveled her voice. That's close enough. The man stopped, breathing hard. I ain't armed, ma'am. Just looking for a place to warm up. She kept the rifle against her shoulder. Where from? South of Rawlins. Got turned around in the storm last week. Been walking since. His coat was threadbare, boots crusted with snow, beard heavy with ice. He looked too worn down to bluff. You can sit by the shed, she said. I'll bring something hot. When Bodhi returned just before dark, he found the stranger asleep beside the stove, boots off, hands curled tight in his lap. Verona stood near the hearth, stirring a pot of broth. Bodhi closed the door behind him. You let him in? He was half frozen, she said. He didn't ask for anything but heat. The man stirred, blinking up at Bodhi. Name's Ellis, he rasped. Didn't mean to trespass. Bodhi studied him, then glanced at Verona. He give you any trouble? No, she said. Not so much as raised his voice. Ellis shifted, wincing. Just need to rest a day or two. Then I'll be out of your way. Bodhi looked at the man's leg. Looks like more than a limp. Busted it in a fall. Been walking crooked since. He crouched beside the stove, unlacing a small pack. From it, he pulled a folded cloth and a tin of salve. Verona knelt beside him. That's not enough. That leg's going to need wrapping. Ellis hesitated. You know how. I watched a doctor set my uncle's leg once, she said. As long as it's not broken clean through, I can brace it. Bodhi stepped back, letting her work. He watched the way she moved quiet, firm, without hesitation. When she finished, she stood and washed her hands in the basin. You'll need to stay off it a few days, she said. You can sleep near the fire. Ellis looked between them. You're not afraid I'll take something in the night? Bodhi met his gaze. You wouldn't make it far if you tried. That night, Verona sat at the table, cutting strips of cloth to use for binding. Bodhi poured water into the basin, scrubbing the trail dust from his hands. You didn't hesitate, he said. He was freezing, she replied. You could have shut the door. I could have, she said, folding another strip. But I've been left outside before. He dried his hands and crossed the room. You've got a way of seeing what should be done, not just what's easy. She looked up. You think that's rare? I think it's rare to do it without looking for thanks. She set the cloth aside. I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because it was right. Outside, the snow fell heavier, brushing against the windows in soft gusts. Inside, the fire held steady. Ellis slept with his back to the wall, wrapped in a quilt Verona had found in the chest at the cabin's foot. Bodhi and Verona sat close on the edge of the bed, her head resting against his shoulder. Do you think he'll stay long? She asked. Doubt it, Bodhi said. A man who's been wandering that long doesn't know how to settle. She nodded, her eyes half-lidded. I used to think I didn't know how either, but I think I just hadn't found the right soil. He turned his head and kissed her hair. You've taken root here. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. So have you. They said no more that night. The fire dimmed, the wind outside carried on, and the cabin stood strong beneath the weight of snow. Inside, warmth held them deep and quiet and steady as the earth itself. Ellis left 3 days later, leaning heavy on a walking stick Bodhi had cut for him. Before he went, he pressed a folded scrap of paper into Verona's hand, a map drawn in pencil, showing a safer pass through the bluffs should she and Bodhi ever need to travel east. He didn't say where he was headed, only that he'd keep to the canyons, away from the roads. Once he was gone, the cabin settled deeper into winter. Snow packed high along the eaves, and the window frames began to groan at night under the shifting weight. Verona rose early and stayed moving. Her hands found rhythm in every task, scraping lye soap, boiling water for laundry, mending seams that had frayed from wear. Bodhi took to carving in the evenings, shaping cedar into handles, dowels, anything that might prove useful come spring. He didn't speak much while he worked, but his quiet was never sharp. He listened. Verona began to tell him things she hadn't thought to share before, not out of secrecy, but because the words had never found space to land. My mother had a singing voice, she said one night. Her needle paused at the hem of her flannel skirt. But she only used it when she thought no one was listening. Bodhi didn't look up. You have hers. No, I took after my father. Steady hands, poor pitch. He smiled faintly, his thumb tracing along the edge of the carved yoke in his palm. You hum when you're thinking. Is it that loud? It's good. She returned to her sewing, her cheeks warm. Each week brought some small shift. The elk tracks that had vanished in December returned, deeper and more frequent. The sky stayed lighter a little longer each day. Verona began planting sprigs of wild thyme in clay pots near the stove. Bodhi built her a shelf along the southern window to give the plants sun. One morning, Verona stood beside the bed, holding a folded quilt she'd found buried in the trunk at the end of it. She turned to him, her eyes searching. "This belonged to someone," she said, "before you came here." Bodhi looked up from oiling the hinges on the front door. It did. She sat beside him, the quilt still in her arms. "You've never spoken of anyone before me." He set the tin of oil aside. "Her name was Claire. We met down in La Junta. She died during childbirth. Never made it past the first frost." Verona didn't speak. She ran her fingers along the edge of the fabric, light blue thread stitched in a lattice of tiny diamonds. "That's why you built this place alone?" she asked. "I didn't know what else to do with what I had left." She folded the quilt carefully. "You don't have to keep hiding her memory. I'd rather know the whole of you." He reached for her hand, his palm rough and warm. "I thought keeping quiet was how I honored her. But maybe remembering her out loud is better." Verona leaned into his shoulder, resting there. "It doesn't take away from what we've found." "No," he said. "It makes it worth more." Late February brought thawed mornings and the scent of damp earth. Verona knelt outside the cabin with a trowel and a basket of onion bulbs. Her sleeves rolled past her elbows. Bodhi had cleared a small patch near the south slope where the snow had melted faster. She pressed each bulb down into the loosened soil, her fingers caked in dirt. "I've never planted something I'd get to see through," she said. Bodhi crouched beside her, handing her the last bulb. "You will now." She looked at him then, the morning sun catching the edge of his jaw. "Would you build a second room onto the cabin someday?" "If you want it." "I'm thinking of the future," she said, "of what might grow here if we tend it right." He brushed a bit of soil from her cheek with his thumb. "You've already made it a home." That spring they built the root cellar together. Verona hauled stones from the ridge while Bodhi dug the trench by hand. They lined it with timber and packed the roof with sod and straw. When it was finished, she stood at its mouth, hands on her hips, and laughed for the first time in months. Not quietly, not to herself, but full and clear. Bodhi watched her, the shovel still in his hand. "I'll take that as a good sign. It's the sound of a woman who's not afraid she'll be left again." By early April, the first shoots of barley pushed through the earth. The days stretched long and warm. Verona moved with ease through the cabin, her hair tied back with a strip of muslin. Cheeks sun-touched and eyes clearer than they'd been since the day she'd stepped down from the chapel steps. One morning, she found Bodhi shaving at the wash basin, the mirror propped against the windowsill. She stood behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I want to marry you," she said, her voice low near his spine. He paused, razor still in hand. "I thought you already had." "Not with witnesses. Not with vows." He turned, his face half-shaven, eyes searching hers. "Do you want that?" "I want to stand beside you and say it plain. I want it to be real in the eyes of the world, not just between these walls." He nodded once, slowly. "Then we'll do it." They rode into the Valley Church 2 weeks later, just as the wildflowers bloomed. Reverend Ike said the words while the wind stirred the grass. She wore a pale blue dress borrowed from the storekeeper's wife. Bodhi wore his best shirt, sleeves mended by her hand. Verona didn't cry. She held his hand steady and listened to each word like she meant to carry them her whole life. Afterward, they rode home in silence, but it was a full silence, the kind that didn't need filling. That night, Bodhi brought out a small parcel from beneath the floorboards. Inside was a pair of silver hair combs he'd traded for with some of the last of his pelts. "I was waiting for the right day," he said. She took them, eyes wide. "They're beautiful. They reminded me of you. Strong. And meant to hold." She slid them into her hair and leaned in close. "Then I'll wear them every day from here on." Years passed, but seasons came easier with each one. The barley grew tall. The cabbage kept through winter. Verona taught a few neighbor children their letters at the table when their mothers came to trade. Bodhi built a second room just as she'd asked. They aged with the land, and in the quiet of each evening, they sat close, not needing words. And when they looked at each other, it was always the same. It was always love, steady and earned. The kind that never had to be spoken twice.